also the reason that I decided to give this talk is because, having watched Wild Wild Country, it was clear that for all its investigation of the political aspects of what was happening around Bhagwan, Osho as he came to be known later, during his years in Oregon, the question was never asked, or if it was only superficially addressed. Why were we there? Like many of us, I grew up with my fair share of childhood wounds, of stuff I needed to work out, and a lot of the wounds that I was carrying had to do with the part that women had played in my life. I was in an orphanage from 4 years old until 9 years old. It was run by nuns, and they were really heavy. And although I felt very loved by my mother before my brother and I were put in the orphanage, those years had really had a profound and painful effect on me, and I had a lot of healing to do from them. My 20s were a time of rebellion and experimentation and exploration, during those years I was reading a lot as well, and looking for answers and trying to figure out what is the meaning of life, what is it really about. And in my late 20s, while I was at Oxford doing memory research, in fact, I read a book by Carl Rogers, and it blew my mind. One afternoon on the beach, I had an extraordinary experience. It was an awakening. It lasted about 30 seconds, and I won't tell you the whole story now. But it was as though I was given a 30-second insight into what I'd been looking for ever since I grew up. And it changed the direction of my life. I let go of my doctorate studies and decided to go the path of personal growth, and worked with various teachers. And in the early 70s, I began to lead my own workshops in London. I became one of the group leaders at a centre called Community, and by the mid-70s I was establishing myself in a minor kind of way as a group leader, a seminar leader for people who were seeking some kind of journey of personal awakening. And I knew that I still had a lot of work to do, so as I was leading workshops, I was also still training and looking for good teachers. And by this time I was seeing people in orange robes around London, and I had a kind of rather superior attitude towards them, that I don't know what these people are about, but I sure don't need a guru. And there's one thing I will never do, and that is have a guru. And Somendra showed up. He had founded this centre Community. And I got to know him enough to be interested in what this Orange movement was really all about. One evening, feeling still very skeptical about this whole Orange thing, I secretly took a cassette tape of Bhagwan talking, and I took it to bed with me, and on my Walkman, you remember those? I listened to it, and I was shocked and awed and devastated, because listening to this man, it was clear that he was in a different dimension from all the teachers that I had worked with. He was streets ahead of all of us. And the way he was talking, I felt totally addressed. And the thing that was devastating for me was, I know I have to go see him. And a couple of weeks later, I found myself on a plane to Pune. So March the 8th, 1977, I found myself sitting in front of Bhagwan. And he initiated me, and he gave me the name Swami Anand Rajan, and told me, your name means a king of bliss. And then he had spent 20 minutes telling me how I was a beggar of misery because I had forgotten my inner kingdom and it was time to go in and reclaim it, which was all very aggravating because I was already a group leader and had a sense of some kind of self-awareness that he had just destroyed. And during this 20 minutes, I was blissed out. It was so amazing to sit with this being and just be seen, because for all that he was taking me apart, it was done with such compassion that I felt seen and appreciated and recognized in a way that had never happened for me. So after 20 minutes, when he said, anything you want to say? I said, yeah, I just want to stay here. So stay here forever. And I said, well, you know, I have commitments. I've made promises that I have to keep in London. I have workshops to lead. The man who made those promises is dead. How can a dead man keep his promises? Alan Lowen no longer exists. Now it's Swami Anand Rajan. And then he laughed. He said, how long are you going to be here? I said, 3 weeks. He said, so you come back and see me before you're due to leave. So, day before I was due to leave, I had darshan with him, and he said, so if you go back to England, how long will it take you to clear everything up? And I said, 2 months. So you go back, finish everything, then you come back and be here forever. Well, it took me 6 months to clear everything up in England, and then I came back to Pune. And the day that I met him, that morning before my evening darshan, I met a beautiful German sannyasin, and after he had initiated me, I spent the night with her and the next 2 years. And when I said it would take me 2 months to finish up in England, she wanted to come with me, and Bhagwan says, very good, you go with him, you'll be good for him. We had a marvelous relationship in that it was agony and ecstasy, and was a really significant period of being opened up in ways that were very difficult for me. Mahari, my girlfriend, she really knew how to get through and touch the painful places, and it was the same the other way around. You know, we were a really alive, intimate relationship, and nobody knows you better and knows how to push your buttons better than your sweetheart, your beloved, your partner, your wife, your husband. It's the way it is, and I'm sure you know that. In the ashram, people who were running the departments were virtually all women. And Bhagwan had set it up this way because he wanted to turn the convention that we lived in on its head, where, especially in the 70s, you know, the world was run by men. And so he upended this. And the basis of his commune was, we are there as disciples. So when we went back to Pune after 6 months, within a couple of weeks I was called to the office and told that one of the group leaders was sick, and could I tomorrow come in and lead a group. It was a bioenergetics group, and I said, yeah, sure, I can do that. A week later, I was called back in the office and told, you and Mahari are moving into the ashram, and you will be leading 2 workshops a month. One is a 3-day workshop, the other is a 7-day workshop, and the long one is called Samapan. And this was the name that Bhagwan had given my workshop. And Samapan means surrender. And I got it immediately. Okay, he's giving this to me. You know, I know that the workshops we lead are our paths of learning and opening and awakening and healing, that we're not just there for the people who have come to the workshop. It's our own journey that is happening. When I was given my workshops, I wasn't given a single word of what I was to do in them. And this for me was a wonderful freedom, because this was where I got to let go of all the politics around working with people. I didn't have any say in who came to my workshops. People would come to Pune, they would sit in front of Bhagwan, and he would give them sannyas, give them their name, and say, you do this workshop, and this workshop, and this workshop. And that was how people came to my groups. So that was how my life in the ashram began. And doors kept on opening for me that took me closer and closer to him. I actually wrote to him one day, and I said, I don't know whether I should be leading groups. And I said to him, you know, I feel very perceptive and very present with people, but I have no compassion. So he called me to Darshan, and he talked to me about how he saw me. And he said, all the compassion that you have known and shown up to now was fake. It just came from your ego, and this ego is disintegrating. And you will feel as though you're in the desert. Let it be so, and lead your groups as though you're in the desert. One day, flowers will grow in the desert, and you will know your real compassion. What he gave me in that was this incredible freedom to be with people the way I could be with them, and to trust that through what was given to me in being with them. I've always felt that when I'm working with people, they are giving me just as much as I'm giving them. And every day of my life is a learning experience for me. When I listened to his cassette that night in London, I was already feeling constricted by my own personality trips, even by my ego as a group leader. I could feel how I was becoming political myself, wanting to work in a way that would make sure that people came back, because they were my source of income. So I was marketing myself, and that means ego involvement. And when I went to Pune, money disappeared. The moment I moved into the ashram, I no longer earned money. I was looked after. We were given a room to live in. We were given clothes that we could choose from as long as they were red or orange. And the food was provided. And suddenly all the politics disappeared from life, because I had chosen to be a disciple. And the reason I chose it was that first meeting with him, it was clear that he could see right through my trips. And I felt not only that he was seeing me, but being in his presence, I felt carried into that same self-awareness and awareness of, in a sense, of being present that he was in. It was as though he lifted me into his own presence and gave me my presence. And so in being a disciple, I recognized that what he was inviting me and everybody else there was, let go of your personality, let go of your personality trips. You don't decide what you're doing now. If you come and live in the ashram, you are giving over your governing of your own life. And this is the disciple trip. A disciple with a master you're saying, okay, I choose to trust you, and I choose to trust you because this is a way of breaking out of my own control of my own personality. And I knew that my control of my personality was very affected by my own wounds and my own survival mechanisms that I had designed over the years growing up. And I see this with the people I work with, and it's why I work the way I do. In my work, what I'm seeking to do is to give people the opportunity to step out of their personality into the magic of being really present. And this was what Bhagwan gave us in no small way. Every morning for 2 hours, he would talk, and we would sit in meditation. And the understanding was that we were simply in meditation while he spoke. For a month he would speak in English, the next month in Hindi. And this alternated throughout the 3 years I was there. So for 1 month, every other month, we didn't understand a word of what he was saying. And this was amazing. Those discourses were in us. Often they were easier to sit through because we didn't understand how he was taking us apart and pulling the rug out from under us and showing us to ourselves in really uncomfortable ways. So this was why I chose to be with him. He was a way for me to get free of being trapped inside my own personality, my own costume that I'd grown up in. And so, as well as being in discourse every morning, I, like everybody, was given the work that I was to do. Okay, my work was leading 2 workshops a month, and the other days of the month I would be editing Hindi discourses that had been translated into English by Indians, and so they needed somebody who was had a good command of the English language to polish them up. That was my work. From the perspective of being a disciple, my surrender was to whatever the work would be. If I'd been told you're cleaning toilets, I knew the surrender was to clean toilets or go work in the kitchen. Whatever. It was the path of discipleship, the path of surrender. Here's surrender for you. I, one evening, went to a sannyasin party, and we got chatting, a few of us, about Shakespeare, because one of my friends he'd been a professional actor, a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and another was very involved in theatre, and I was quite involved in theatre as well. My first profession was I was a teacher of English and drama, so I had an attraction to drama. So we said, hey, wouldn't it be great to put on a Shakespearean play in the ashram? And the obvious play to go for was A Midsummer Night's Dream, because it's so full of magic and mystery. And the moment we put the word out, the actors and actresses came out of the woodwork, and before any time we had the cast together and we began rehearsing, and I and one other were directing it, and it was becoming so sophisticated in its shape and form that we decided, with the ashram's blessings, that it could be staged in a theatre in Pune, not just in the ashram. So this was very exciting for us, and there was even talk of it going to Bombay, which did eventually happen. And one morning I got asked to come to the office after discourse. Rajan, Bhagwan says you're not to play any more part in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I was really upset, really upset and angry, and so broken-hearted I went back to my room and I was sitting on my bed and I was in tears and feeling like this is so unfair, this is so unjust. My creativity, and I was the one who came up with this idea in the first place. It's not fair. And I'm sitting there chewing the carpet or chewing the mattress, and in comes Karuna, the woman who organizes all the workshops. And she looks at me and she said, "Rajen, what's the matter?" She said, "You're supposed to be leading a group." Because 10 o'clock that morning I was starting Samapan. And I turned her and I said, I can't do it, I can't. I'm just... And she shut the door and went away. And I just stayed there and went on being devastated. 10 minutes later she came back, she walked in and she said, "I have a message for you from Bhagwan. He says, go and lead your workshop exactly the way you are right now. Surrender." And when it came from him, there wasn't anything I could do. Okay, you know, this is an invitation. And at that time I had a reputation as a really tough group leader. I was hard. You know, I've lost a lot of edges by now in my old age, but that time my nickname was the Sword. So I walk in, they're sitting in a circle, and there's this apprehension that there always is, you know, Rajen's coming, the group's beginning. And I walked in, and I walked into the center, and I sat down, and I just went on crying. And they're, of course, totally shocked. And they all came around me and just loved me. And it changed something in me. It was another little breaking down of my ego trip of being the great Rajen, the great group leader, which I was becoming. And things like that were constantly happening. So that was the structure, and it was this structure that gave us the framework in which day after day after day we were invited and challenged to keep letting go of our trips and to simply live in the present, because this was the place that it was good to be, was in the present. And not only was it wonderful to sit with Bhagwan, but the ashram was a gathering of extraordinary men and women who were, they were all pioneers in their own way. They'd all chosen to dare to be in this disciple relationship. And as a community, we were having a wonderful time with each other. There were a lot of musicians, there were a lot of very creative people, from all walks of life, architects, lawyers, bakers, whatever, you name it, they were there. And what Bhagwan was giving us was a community, or a commune in fact, in which we were invited to live as totally as possible, as we dared, and to live always in the present. So his wasn't the orthodox ashram where there's usually the separation of the sexes, and sex is not something that you're going to have anything to do with because you're living the holy ashram life. His was a very unholy ashram in which we were invited, never mind trying to be perfect, be total. And this was his path. He said, you know, if you want to get free of your preoccupation with sex or any other desires, live them. Live them so totally that in the end you transcend them. This is the path. So this was the ethos, and the commune was a very vibrant place. We worked hard, we played hard, we made love and got into a lot of trouble doing so, because a lot of us, like myself, were in relationships, and in our relationships we were still carrying our stuff, our jealousy, our possessiveness. And we were in this incredible playground where there were so many beautiful men and women that the wish to play was very strong, and the opportunity to play was there all the time. And then, of course, there would be going back to your partner and having to deal with the consequences of your playfulness. And Bhagwan was guiding us in ways that really threw the textbooks away. As the doors kept on opening, I became one of his darshan guards, which meant that every evening I would be at darshan. So that I would finish my workshop and have dinner and go and sit in darshan with him. And in the morning, everybody would come to the discourses. So there would be 2,000-3,000 people sitting there. The darshans in the evening, people were invited to come to darshan. They would write and ask. And people arriving and taking sannyas would come, people leaving would come, and people who had questions and issues would come. And then there were the guards who were there all the time. Being a guard, my karate was never very good. That wasn't the point. This was really just a device on his part, so we didn't get too egotistical about being invited to be with him every day. One evening I'm sitting there in darshan, and a couple have been invited to come to darshan because they're having problems in their relationship. And so they sit in front of Bhagwan, and the woman tells him how she's completely, she doesn't know what to do. She's in profound distress because her man is playing with so many women in the commune, and she feels that it's really destroying their relationship and their intimacy, and she doesn't know what to do. And Bhagwan sits there, and he turns to the man and he says, "This is no way to be looking after your intimacy. You have to bring your love to your woman. And yes, you can see all the beautiful women that you could be with, but you are in an intimate relationship. Be there with her. Live your relationship just with her." And she's happy. And, everything he says immediately goes out through the commune, so everybody gets the message, oh my God, it's wrong. We're not supposed to be playing around with everybody or feeling bad that we can't. We're supposed to feel good that we're only with our partner. And the next evening, another couple come. Same issue. Exactly the same. They've come to darshan because she's having trouble not knowing how to deal with her man wanting to be so playful. So Bhagwan turns to the woman. He says, "Why are you so upset? You are in this garden and there are so many beautiful butterflies and bees in this garden. Naturally, your man wants to play with the butterflies, of course. And you, locked in your jealousy and your possessiveness, and you are here to let go of this. And if you love him, you let him be." What is love? Love is letting be. So if you love your man, you let him be, you let him play. And when it is upsetting for you, that is the time to love yourself in your upset, so that you can grow through this and grow into freedom. And this goes out into the commune. And so it was, everything he said, he would say the opposite of, and it was like constantly pulling the rug out from under us. And the message was, you have to feel it, you have to find it, you have to discover it for yourselves, whatever it is. And one day he said, what you're learning is to trust. And you learn to trust unconditionally. Because when your trust is unconditional, a miracle happens. One day, I'm going to make it more difficult for you to trust. And as time goes by, more and more difficult. Until one day, it is impossible for you to trust. And still, you have to trust, because only then the miracle happens. Okay, okay, total surrender, total trust. And of course it's a total catch-22, which in Pune didn't matter that much, because it was such an extraordinary community to be in. There was so much discovering and exploration and playing, and it didn't matter if things went wrong, because we were only there learning from our mistakes. And the only things that could go wrong were being upset, feeling like I can't do this anymore, feeling exhausted, getting amoebas and giardia, and getting sick, and dengue fever. Those were the only things that could go wrong. I had all of them. Being with him, it is so hard to put into words what it was to be with him. Eventually there came a time when I wouldn't always be in darshan. Sometimes I would be guarding his personal door in the residence behind the hall where the darshans were held, and I would stand there with my karate staff, and he would come out from his room and he would namaste to me, and then he would go down the passage and into Chuang Tzu Hall, and darshan would happen. And by this time, darshan was changing. It wasn't just answering questions. The musicians were playing. There was a certain point where all the lights would go out and people would be around Bhagwan, the women he had chosen to help him give his energy darshans. I actually received the first energy darshan he ever gave. When the lights went down, he would do his Shaktipat on the forehead of the sannyasin who was receiving the energy darshan. Sometimes there would be two in him, have one thumb here and one thumb there, and the women would be sitting around supporting the energy darshan in the dark. And then the music would escalate, become crazier and crazier and crazier, and then at the height the lights would go on, the energy darshan was over, Bhagwan would stand up and namaste and make his way back down the passage to his room. So one evening I'm there, and the lights go out, and the energy that is coming from Chuang Tzu Hall is so overwhelming. It's like it's like a tidal wave, and I'm standing there and I can't stand anymore. It's just taking me down, and I end up lying on the ground, spread-eagled on my belly, and I feel like I can't move. And then the music stops, the lights go on, and I realize he's coming. And I manage to drag myself up to my feet, and I stand there and I namaste to him, and he never says anything, but this evening he stops and he looks at me and he says, "Rajen, you look as though you have seen the Holy Ghost." And I felt like I had been overwhelmed by the Holy Ghost. And there were all sorts of extraordinary things that happened. When I had only been in the ashram a couple of weeks, I wrote to him and said, I really don't know if I'm in the right place, because I sit at lunch and I hear the conversations of sannyasins around me, and they're so esoteric, and they speak in these spiritual terms that I've never heard of, and I don't know anything about, and I feel as though, it's like I don't know enough to be here. Maybe, I should go away and study and come back in a few years. And the next morning in discourse, he answered my question and said, "Rajen, don't worry about all this spiritual bullshit. Just go back to your room and have a good sleep. And he talked on then about the spiritual bullshit and how people were caught up in it and how it was all part of the ego trip, the spiritual ego trip, and how we needed to come to a place where we were not having any experience. You know, you have to go beyond all experience. And he would say things like this that just invited some understanding of a space that was beyond. And I'd had a 30-second experience of that space on a beach in California before I ever had heard of Bhagwan. And it never left me. It has never left me. Because in those 30 seconds, it was as though I was one with all that is. And it is all being created here and now, moment to moment. And, you know, people would call it a satori, okay? Doesn't matter what it's called, but it has stayed with me. It changed my life from that moment on. So being with him, I would be carried again into this space. And so I understood what he meant about the spiritual bullshit. I just also had a personality that wanted to say there's something wrong with me, I'm not good enough. Because that's what I was born with, that there's something wrong with me, it's my fault, I'm not good enough. And I was still working that through in being with him. So I didn't go back to my room and have a good sleep. And some years later I learned something about that. But let me come there another way. One evening I'm standing at the gate waiting to go into darshan, and a sannyasin comes by, and we're chatting there together, and he tells us he's just had the most amazing dream that he ever had in his life. And I said, you know, I've never had a dream that I could call the most amazing dream of my life. Just never happened. And went into darshan. That night, I had the most amazing dream I have ever had, bar one. And I'll come to that later. And years later, in Oregon, Bhagwan's, he was at that time his chief disciple, Tirtha. He said to me one day, he said, "Hey Rajan," he said, "you remember when you first came to Pune and you asked a question and Bhagwan said, don't worry about the spiritual bullshit, just go home and have a good sleep." He said, "Did you go and have a good sleep?" And I said, "Well, no, actually I didn't. I went to breakfast with my girlfriend." He said, "You missed." And Tirtha loved to tell people that they missed. This was his big thing, "You have missed." But I had to recognize I had wondered during those intervening years, because it was as though something happened during our sleep. It was as though Bhagwan used our sleeping time to work with us in really mysterious ways that went beyond logic and comprehension. And people had many stories. Mahari, that I was with for a couple of years, we had such a wild relationship, and sometimes it would get physical. And one morning we were so fighting each other, and she was screaming at me and clawing me, and they heard the sound of her screaming in the discourse in Buddha Hall. So after discourse, sure enough, one of the office women comes to us, and she says, "I have a message for you from Bhagwan." He says, "You are to stop the fighting. Your bodies belong to me." Okay. what does that mean? But it was clear the fighting has to stop. But it didn't stop, and we went on, and it was all about jealousy and possessiveness and being attracted to others, until one day Mahari had had enough of it, and she went to the office and said, I can't be with Rajen anymore. Within 2 hours, the working sannyasins who were looking after accommodations had come in and moved me to another room. And so now I find myself in a room partitioned, where on the other side of the partition is a really nice Canadian guy who was a guitarist, and we got on pretty well, and I was okay with that by this time. I'd been there a couple of years by now. Somehow, whether it came from Bhagwan or Sheila did not like group leaders. And she gave us always a really hard time. But anyway, it was as though it had been decided the time has come to turn the screws a bit, to push Rajen. So my Canadian roommate was moved out, and an Indian sannyasin was moved in, and a loft was built, and upstairs his mother lived. So now, okay, surrender. It was just so weird, and also it was clear that they're pushing me. How far does my surrender go? And then, by this time I was with a beautiful new French lady who didn't live in the ashram, and a point came, as happened for all the people who were not living in the ashram, where she needed to go back to the West. She didn't have the means to finance herself unless she was moved into the ashram, and I wanted her to come and live in the ashram with me, and asked, and no, this doesn't happen, Rajen. It's not time for Pramada to come and live in the ashram. So she left and went back to Europe, and I'm there now eating my heart out and feeling more and more ill, until the day comes that I feel like I can't be here anymore. I have to go back to the West. And so I wrote to Bhagwan and said, I can't be here. I need to go back to the West. And at that time, my stepfather died. I didn't have a great relationship with my stepfather, but it felt like a godsend. And the message came back from Bhagwan, let the dead bury the dead. And let go of this urge to go back to the West. So surrender, another surrender. And I felt myself getting more and more sick. My weight, I was down to about 120 pounds by now. And I felt like if I go on being here, I'm going to die. And I'm really missing my girlfriend. So some time went by, and I wrote to him again. And this time he said, go with my blessings. I thought, oh, thank you. So I went back to Europe. And within months of my leaving, the word came out that the Pune ashram was closing, and Bhagwan was moving to Oregon. And at first, no, he came to New York, and he was living in I can't remember exactly where it was. It was called the Castle, anyway. I got invited to come and have a little mini darshan with him, and it was very brief, and it was like a way of just re-establishing the connection. By this time, I'd made a lot of money, because now, living back in Europe, I was leading workshops in all the ashrams and the communes around Europe, doing the rounds, and making a lot of money. And I didn't really know what to do with it. And one day I got a phone call from one of the women around Bhagwan, who was one of his main fundraisers. Her name was Sushila. Rajen, you got any money? I said, yeah, I have. How much? So I told her how much. Send it to Oregon. We need it. Do I mean it? And this was big, you know. Do I really mean it? And I felt like, yeah, I do. I have to mean it. You know, just because I needed to go back to the West doesn't mean that, you know, my journey is over. So I kept a small amount and sent the rest. And a couple of weeks later, I got a message, Rajen, we want you to go and live in the ashram in the Mojave Desert behind LA. It's called Gitam, and the main group leaders are gathering there because this is where all the workshops are going to happen until the infrastructure has been built in this magnificent new ranch that has been found in the high desert in Oregon. Okay, so I went to Gitam. When I first arrived there was a big event to celebrate the fact that Rajen has come. And so I did a big event in my royal way. You know, Rajen means a king, okay? And I had a certain regal flair to the way I did things in those days. And the director of Gitam was one of my dearest friends. His name was Amitabh, and he was somewhat older than me, a brilliant therapist. And he died a few years ago. And he was like he was always there somehow on the lookout for me. I felt very cared for by him. And when I had done my event in Gitam with lots of hoo-ha and music and happening, and I left the hall where the event had happened, and Amitabh walked down the path with me. He put his arm around me. He said, Rajen, there's something I have to say to you. You're not as special as you think you are. And it went right in. You know, it took me apart in a fabulous way. It freed me from something. And I saw the whole special trip that I had grown into, being Swami and Rajen, the King of Bliss. And that was another opening on this path of waking up and being present and being happy to just be. So, I was a year at Gitam. By then, many people had been called up to live on the ranch, and after about a year, my time came. So now, suddenly, I was put on a bus to come up to Oregon, and I entered the ranch. My first disappointment was immediate. And it was somehow I imagined that by now I would have my own room. And once again, I had to surrender to being in a shared room. He was a totally okay guy, and I was put to work painting the rooms that would become the group rooms. And after a week, I decided I'm out of here. Bhagwan was in total seclusion, except for that darshan. Actually, it was New Jersey, the castle. Except for that darshan where he gave me a cowboy hat. Except for that, I hadn't seen him since I left Pune. And I just didn't like the way it felt on the ranch from the very beginning. And it wasn't that I minded painting the walls. It was everything around that. The whole setup felt to me somehow something was wrong with it. And I didn't know what, and I knew, I'm here as a sannyasin. This is my surrender. But where I had come to was, okay, I can be a sannyasin, but I don't have to live in this commune. And so I left. I went back to Europe, and I spent the next 3 months living with my girlfriend, my French girlfriend, on the island of Ibiza, having a wonderful, wonderful time. And I would leave the island to go lead groups in sannyasin centers around Europe and come back to the island and go on having a wonderful time. And after 3 months, I went to Stockholm, Sweden, to lead a group. And I had a kind of epiphany. Somewhere in the middle of the group, it came to me just really intensely, you're not finished with the commune. You have to go back. So I flew back to Ibiza, and my girlfriend picked me up at the airport, and halfway across, driving back across the island to where we lived, I told her, I'm going back to Oregon. She flipped out. She was very, very upset. And I was upset at leaving her, but I knew I'm not finished with this. I don't know why, I don't like the place, and I know that I have to be there. I have to see it through. So I went back. Sure enough, I was put into a little A-frame with an Indian. I didn't know why Sheila had this thing about putting me in places with Indians. I knew that going back I would be punished, because this always happened. If you left and came back, then you had to go through your time of atonement for having left. So I wasn't leading groups, I was to go to the kitchen. And the kitchen was notorious. It was run by a woman called Diksha, who, much as I have come to love her in the years since, at that time she was a classic bitch and ruled the kitchen with a rod of iron. And for me, she, together with Sheila and a few others, they were the nuns from the orphanage, That's who they were in my psyche. And I'd seen that for a long time and just felt like, okay, this is another reason why it's important for me to be here, to kind of somehow get free of the stuff that I carry in me about the nuns. And there was one nun in particular who terrorized me. Her name was Sister Damien. And she was a nightmare. You can read about her in my first book if it ever comes out. She really, when I saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, she was Nurse Ratched to a T. So, yeah, I took it for granted that I would go through the mill again. And I'd only been working in the kitchen for 3-4 days when Diksha called all the kitchen staff together and said, I need somebody to run the tea tent down in the middle of Rajneeshpuram. And it was cold, it was winter, nobody wanted to do it, and I stuck up my hand. Yes, I want to do it. And it got me out of the kitchen, and I was on my own in my tea tent, and I could bring in my boombox and play my music, and I loved it. And I spent some very happy months running the tea house for the construction workers around the ranch. And when I wasn't running the tea house, I was a bus driver. We had bought a whole convoy of yellow school buses, and these were how everybody travelled around the ranch, except for the privileged ones with cars. And I just settled into the routine, and after a while was told it's time for you to lead groups again. And by this time the ranch was really evolving. It now had its own hotel and a new magnificent Buddha hall and its own airport and plane and boutiques and restaurant, and it was turning into a little city. And the move was afoot to incorporate the city, and it was clear there was a lot of political stuff going on. It was important that I and the other group leaders knew as little about the politics as possible, because we were working with people who were coming to the ranch anew to discover Bhagwan, and to many of whom became sannyasins. A lot of people became sannyasins after doing a group with me or the other group leaders. And so Srila wanted us to be kind of kept innocently in the dark about the whole political thing that was going on, so that we could work very directly with people without having to get into discussions. We didn't know what was going on. And I didn't particularly want to know. There was Jesus Grove, where Sheila ran her whole trip with a team of women, and Bhagwan began to appear once a day in a magnificently airbrushed Rolls Royce that would drive through the ranch and out onto the Oregon country roads, and we would all line up and namaste him as he drove by, and he would drive by slowly, and so we would get to see our master once a day. And the this lunchtime meditation, momentary meditation with Bhagwan, was the high point of the day. And there was a lot of music, and he would, every now and then he would stop and somebody would get a little special blessing from him, and then he would drive out onto the country roads and do whatever he did on the country roads in Oregon, and then come back and we would all namaste as he drove by again. And gradually the number of Rolls Royces increased and increased. Each one would be airbrushed with a different design, so that there were, for example, one was the Max Escher geese that turn into waves, another was just flames, another was like a Paul Klee painting or a Cubist painting, and they were fabulous, and they accumulated and would be parked in this big area outside his residence that was up on a hill in the middle of the ranch. And I was being regularly sent out to lead workshops as well as leading them on the ranch. I would be sent to towns and cities around the States and to different countries in Europe, all of it as a means to bring more and more money onto the ranch. And of course people wondered, where on earth are all these Rolls Royces coming from? And when it was all over, in fact, I had a chat with Bhagwan's accountant, the ashram accountant, who was a good friend of mine. And she said, well, whenever the ranch is going broke, I go to Bhagwan and I tell him, Bhagwan, we're going bankrupt. And he says, buy me another Rolls Royce. And it worked, because in order to buy him another Rolls Royce, the word had to go out to the fat cats, to the Hollywood crowd, and the sannyasins who were mega rich. And they would pour money in the end there were 92 Rolls Royces parked outside his house. They were sold off to a Texan when it was all over, who died shortly after. The thing that was hard for me on the ranch was the gradual influx of rules and regulations. Pune had been really a commune where we had this sense of freedom to explore, to be total. On the ranch, the freedom to be total, it was as though it was being honed down day after day and week after week as more and more rules came in. And there were things happening that just didn't feel good. Like suddenly we had security guards, and then suddenly the security guards were carrying guns. And my girlfriend, this was when I finally got to have kind of my own room, when I fell in love with a woman on the ranch who stood in very good favour with Sheila and the office crowd, and we were given a room together. So that was sweet. And my woman, Sargamo her name was one of the security guards. And I would ask her about what was going on, and her stock answer was, hey, I'm not allowed to talk about it. And I'd say, okay. And then she became one of several women who were invited certain evenings to go to Bhagwan's house. And she was always, like the others, instructed to dress in a certain way and not to wear underwear. And I, noticing this, was asking her about it and getting upset about it, and she was doing everything she could to just assure me that, hey, it's not what you think, and yeah, he does touch us as he did in the energy darshans, but it's not sexual. And I was left just with that. One day I'd been sent to Europe again, leading workshops, and as I came back from Portland to the ranch and was picked up at the entrance to the ranch by the driver who was going to bring me home to my room, he was driving a different road. And I said, hey, this isn't the way to my room. Rajan, you don't live there anymore. I said, what do you mean? I live there with Sargamo. She's not with you anymore. And your belongings have been moved to another room. And I was freaked out, and in the night made my way to our room, went up the stairs to the room. The door was locked, and I could hear very intimate sounds coming from the other side of the door. And it was clear she was with a new lover. And what I did with it was we weren't monogamous. I had been in Europe, I'd been playing, having lovers, and my assumption was, it's my fault. She's decided to leave me because I've been playing with other women in Europe. And again, it fed into my old wound. It's my fault, which comes from the very beginning of my life. And all I could do was leave and accept that this had happened. And it just added to my sense of mistrust in being there. And at the same time, my mistrust is what I have to let go of, because the trust has to be unconditional, and it will become more and more difficult to trust. There was a period where for 7 months, the only days I was not leading a group was when I was travelling to one or coming back from one. That was how my schedule was. It was just continuous work. And sometimes I would sit in my group and people would think I was in meditation, because I would sit there with them with my eyes closed. And I was just taking the opportunity to have a little rest, because it was so endless, the work. There was the endurance that it took to just keep going and to work day after day and no breaks was really intense. And to add to this, I was then informed that in the evenings I would be waiting in the restaurant. So now I led groups during the day. I was a waiter in the restaurant in the evenings, and surrender, and it's going to become more and more difficult to trust. Yeah, okay, it is. Yeah, I remember. Okay, surrender. So life went on like this, and it was clear that there was stuff going on that we would catch a sense of. Something had happened in Salem with salmonella poisoning, and there were rumours running around that it had something to do with the office and Sheila and Pooja, and it was clear that there was a lot going on in order to try and safeguard the Ranches Incorporation as a city. And there was a vote coming up, and the rumour was that the salmonella poisoning in Salem had been actually brought about through the work of sannyasins who had gone there to poison salads in restaurants in order that people would be sick on the voting day. I mean, it was such an insane rumour that it seemed ludicrous. And it just seemed like the kind of nonsense that would be purveyed in order to bring the ranch into more and more disfavour. And it was becoming more and more disreputable to the people of Oregon. And I couldn't help feeling that this was no fault on the part of the people of Oregon. This was something that was actually being pushed by the way that Sheila and the people around her were conducting their politics. Because the little that I did get to see of it, when the whole ranch would be called together and Sheila would talk about what was going on with Oregon and incorporation and voting rights and so on, and how against us they were, the animosity, the hostility, and above all the aggressiveness that she came over with just spoke louder than anything she said to the contrary. And gradually the rules, as I say, they came in more and more. One day we were told you're not allowed to walk in the hills, and Sargamo told me, well, there are rifle ranges out there, and I guess they don't want anybody to get hurt. Around this time, AIDS was becoming the major issue that it became in the 80s. And the instruction came that from now on, we were always to wear condoms and rubber gloves, and if we engaged in oral sex, we should use something to lie between our mouth and sex.
That's right.
And there were women who were instructed by Sheila to, in a sense, spy and find out if people were obeying these rules. And if we left the ranch and had sex with anybody, in order to make sure that HIV didn't infect anybody on the ranch, we would wear an orange bead on our mala. And this orange bead would let everybody know that we were untouchable for the next 22 days, long enough for us to have an HIV test and be declared HIV negative, and we could then play again. And of course, there were people who were HIV positive on the ranch. And a new area of the ranch was created. It was in a valley called Desiderata, and everybody who was HIV positive was sent to live in this separate valley. This went along with Bhagwan beginning to reappear, and he began to hold satsangs again in this magnificent new Buddha hall. And the people from Desiderata would have to sit in a separate enclosure from everybody else. And stuff like this was, for me, really, really hard to take. And the only thing that I had that was keeping me there was, I'm going to make it more and more difficult for you to trust. One day I will make it impossible. Eventually, it became clear to Sheila that the only way that the Rajneeshpuram could be incorporated as a city would be to have enough votes to outvote the rest of the county. And so she was looking for a way to manage this. And one of her team came up with the brilliant idea to bring in homeless people and give them a new home. And so buses were sent out to cities around the states, as far away as New York and Philadelphia, Florida, and homeless people were invited to come and live a new life in paradise with a home and everything that they were longing for as homeless people. And about 3,000 people, homeless people, were brought into the ranch and given an area where they lived. And I was one of the group leaders who was instructed to work with them to help integrate them into our way of life. The Oregonian county authorities had gotten wind of what was going on and were looking for a way to stop this from happening. And they managed it. They came up with a finding. There was a regulation that required any resident to have been resident for, I think it was 6 months before they could vote. And this was way less than 6 months that the street people had been brought in. And so the whole thing fell apart. And within a very short time, these homeless people disappeared. They were bussed out again. And it is true that during the weeks that they were living on the ranch, life became very different. They had, as you can imagine, countless personality problems and issues, many of them manifesting in hostile ways or ways that were self-destructive and potentially destructive to others. So that it was difficult. It was a difficult time, and I didn't know how much their leaving was to do with this is a failed experiment, but I didn't, deep down it was like, this is wrong. This is so wrong. Especially when I heard that they weren't bussed back to where they came from. They were just taken down to Portland and around Portland and dropped off. And it was becoming so that in my final year, 1984, I found I had a new personal mantra. And my personal private mantra was, how much longer? How much longer? Because it was feeling that corruption was just creeping in beyond any device asking us to find unconditional trust. It just seemed that it wasn't about a master's device. And what was unknowable for me and for most of us was how much of this is coming from Bhagwan and how much of this is coming from Srila. And I think this became the question in the minds of more and more sannyasins who are living on the ranch. And my sense was, I guess my way of keeping myself there, keeping myself in some kind of trust was, this is Sheila's shit. And I have one special regret from my time on the ranch. When the street people were there, the amount of money that the ranch had to play with was diminishing day by day. And it came to a point where we were asked to live on very meager food rations. So the breakfast, for example, became a peanut butter sandwich. And one morning, for some reason or other, I had to go down to Jesus Grove, where Sheila had her enclave. And I walked in, and there were Sheila and all her team sitting around a long table with tablecloth and a sumptuous spread of food and drinks. And my regret, what I wanted to do in that moment was to walk up to the table and take the tablecloth and just... And the thing that stopped me was surrender, trust. And so I didn't say anything. One morning I had a dental appointment. We had our own dentist on the ranch, and I had a filling, and after the appointment I decided to walk back to Rajneesh International Meditation University, which is where all the groups were held. It was a long walk, and I was taking the opportunity to feel a bit of freedom through just having a long walk through the ranch. And a question popped into my head. If I could have one thing in my life right now, what would it be? And what came was to sit with him again. This was all I wanted, to sit with my master again. A week, maybe less, maybe days later, I'm in my workshop. I'm sitting in the group room with a group. There's a knock on the door. One of the women from Sheila's office pokes her head in and says, Rajan. I stepped out and she said, be at Jesus Grove at 6 o'clock this evening, freshly bathed and no fragrances. And I knew what this meant from my Pune days, because Bhagwan was very allergic to all kinds of things, including all kinds of fragrances and scents. And so whenever we went to darshan, and when we went to discourse, we had to bathe without using any fragrances at all. So, of course, just knowing that I had been invited was everything. So at 6 o'clock I arrive at Jesus Grove, and 20 of us are driven up to Bhagwan's residence. And we are shown into a room not much bigger than this. And there are cushions set, and we sit down, and he comes in. And he's wearing the simple robes that he used to wear in Pune, none of this fancy regalia, just this simple white robe. And he stands and namastes to us and sits in his chair. And I remember when he began talking, his voice was so quiet. And he began to talk about the rose. And to tell us how the rose has no regard for how perfect it is. That it is its perfectly imperfect self. And from this, he went on to talk about enlightenment and how we're all so busy trying to get enlightened and trying to find our way to the impossible, and how simple enlightenment really is. And the fact is, some of us are already enlightened. And then he begins to name some of the 20 people sitting in front of him. 21st, who couldn't be there, was my friend Amitabh. He was named as one of the enlightened. And 8 people were named enlightened. I wasn't one of them. And then Bhagwan turned his eyes to me and said, and I forgot Rajen. So now I'm declared enlightened. And we were instructed at the end of this gathering to not say a word, so this was to be kept totally secret. By next morning, it was all over the ranch. It wasn't just all over the ranch. Messages were coming from every sannyasin ashram around the world. It all went out like wildfire. And it was, I didn't know what to do with it. There were people who would come up to me and bow and touch my feet. There were other people who would come up to me and almost spit in my face. What, you Rajen enlightened? Who are you kidding? What's going on? This is just bullshit. And I simply, I just did not know what to do with it, except not do anything with it. My mind said, I remember Bhagwan saying that when you're enlightened, you no longer dream. I dream. And I couldn't get past that. That was all I could have to do with it. 2 days later, again, I'm in my group working, knock on the door, Rajen, be at Jesus Grove this evening at 6 o'clock, bathed, no sense. This time 36 of us are brought to his residence. And this time Bhagwan talks to us about leaving his body, and that he will leave his body in summer at one of the celebrations, and he's instructing us on what our roles will be, what our functions will be on the ranch after he leaves his body, and very specific instructions too about his funeral pyre and who is to carry it, and that it's to be made of sandalwood and so on and so forth. And he gives us titles, and my title is Sambuddha Swami Anandarajan. By this time I've also been given an honorary doctorate, so I am now an Acharya as well. So my full title is Sambuddha Swami Anandarajan Acharya DPhil. And he tells me and the other Sambuddhas in the room that our function is to look after the spiritual well-being of sannyasins. And then there are 2 other categories. One is bodhisattvas, and they have a very practical function. They're like the new office that will be after he leaves his body. The third one I don't remember. After I was declared enlightened, I got really tired of leading groups. I really had enough of it, and I wanted out. And I kept going to the office and saying, look, all I want to do is work in the construction crew. And they just, forget it, Rajen, we need you leading groups. Until one day, to my astonishment, I was told, you can go join the construction crew. And I got what for me it was like a kid's toy. I got to be the driver of a huge machine. It was a huge forklift truck working on the building sites. And I was in heaven because I love driving, and even though this didn't drive fast, it was a buzz to work with all its possibilities on very uneven ground. It's totally my scene. I loved it. And I didn't want to go back to group leading. I was fine. I could live on the ranch until whenever. Didn't have to go out and leave. And the thing that was most precious about it was the group leaders were always kind of regarded as somewhat separate from the guys who were building houses, cooking meals, farming, ranching, and so on. And I now felt really integrated with the community. And then came the day that the message came, Rajen, that's the end of that. You have to go back to group leading now. And I was so pissed off. And I went to the office and I was really upset about it. And I said, made it clear, I do not want to lead groups again. All I want to do is work in construction and just really be a part of the community. And Pratima, the woman I was saying this to, said, Rajen, I thought you were enlightened. And I said, Pratima, I tried it and I didn't like it. And that is kind of how I feel about enlightenment. The less it is set up, the better. And I think that the enlightened people around the world don't make a song and dance of it. It's something you just sense about them. The reason that Bhagwan has kept this seclusion, by the way, is because the conditions under which he was permitted to live in the United States were that he didn't work, that he was allowed in on the basis of his fragile health. And so he could live here, but he mustn't do his work. And if he sat with us in discourse and darshan, that was him doing his work. So he wasn't permitted to. And this was why he was in this seclusion, having just these private illegal meetings with sannyasins doing his work. Until Srila came up with the idea that the members of the media could come and interview Bhagwan. And this wouldn't be work. This would just be Bhagwan being interviewed by press and TV, and major celebrities would come and interview him. And each evening there would be this meeting with the world press or TV media. And I was one of the people who was instructed to be there every evening, and other sannyasins would be invited, so that it would effectively be darshan again. And these evenings became very strange happenings. Some evenings, the way he spoke was the way I had known him in Pune, just in his immaculate presence, and coming from such a space of awareness and understanding and compassion that it was just blissful to sit with him. And other evenings, he was political and judgmental and accusing, and as it seemed to me sometimes, deceitful. And I found this extremely difficult to be with. And my mantra was really playing up, how much longer, how much longer, how much longer. Yeah, as I say, I was constantly being sent out to lead workshops around the world by now. I was on the ranch when it happened, when suddenly we were all informed that Sheila has left. Apparently Sheila and the women around her had taken off in a plane and overnight, and it seemed that the feds were coming in to make arrests, The atmosphere in the ranch the next day was joyous. It seemed to be the beginning of a new era in the life of the ranch. And Bhagwan started to talk about Sheila and what she'd done and how much corruption she had brought into the ranch. And one of the things he said was, Sheila has been bugging the rooms of people in the ashram, including mine, and she is listening in and recording what people are saying. It was true. There were bugging devices in a lot of people's rooms, including the room where Sargamo and I had lived together. Sargamo came to me and apologized. And she said, you know, the reason that she threw me out was because our room was bugged, and Sheila, listening in on the conversations going on between Sargamo and I, decided that it was too dangerous for Sargamo, a security guard and somebody who was in on a lot of things in the office, and I to be together. And so Sargamo was told, you know, it's just, you can't be with this guy. And it was, you know, Sargamo was in her own surrender to the needs of the commune. I was then sent out again to Europe, and my function this time was, you have to help the communes because they're in turmoil. Since Sheila's departure, nobody knows what's going on, and we don't want the ashrams around the world falling apart, so go help. So I had already been to Switzerland and flown to London, and in London I was waiting for a business visa to go to Sydney, Australia, to help the communes in Sydney and in Perth. And my business visa just wasn't coming. And one morning I called the Sydney commune and said, hey, you know, what's happening? Rajen, you're not going to get your business visa. Bhagwan just got arrested trying to leave the States. And they told me that he had been arrested flying out of the ranch in a Learjet that had to land in Charlotte, North Carolina. And for me, this was the end. I was leading a group one day on the ranch, and somebody asked me, if the feds did come in to bust the ranch, what would Bhagwan do? And I said, he wouldn't do anything. He'd just sit up on the hill and laugh, because that was my sense of him. And so, in London, how it was for me was, he's run away. He's split because the feds are coming in. I don't have to do this anymore. It wasn't that easy. I went back to bed and I cried because it was like the breaking of everything. And after a couple of hours, I sat up and I looked to the walls of this room, and there was nobody else there. And I said, oh my God, I'm leaving. And I got up and I dressed, and I spent the whole day walking through London, totally blissed out, feeling I don't belong to anybody anymore. My body is my own. I don't have to do this trip anymore. And it was a moment of a day of incredible ecstatic liberation. And then within a day or two, it came to me, I have to deal with the practicalities of this. So the first thing I did was to call a good friend of mine, Viresh, who ran a Humaniversity in Holland, one of the big Osho communes, or Bhagwan communes in those days. And he arranged for me to go stay with friends in northern Italy. And I did so. I went and stayed there, just asking myself, do I really mean this? And it was hard to mean it all the way through, because of all that I would be letting go of. Like everybody I knew, all my friends were sannyasins. My world was the sannyasin world. And to see that I would be letting go of it into something that I had nothing out there. And I had no money, I had no bank account, nothing. So I had to know I really meant it. And I called Viresh. Or he called me and he said, "Hey Rajen, they're looking for you. The people on the ranch want to know where you are." And he said, "Why don't you come hang out here for a while?" So I made my way up to the Humanversity and hung out with Viresh and his crew for a couple of weeks. And then I called the ranch and said, "I want you to know that I'm leaving. I'm just going to come back to collect my things." So within days I flew back to Portland. I had my ticket, of course, because that was part of what I was given. Whenever I went traveling, I had my tickets there and back, plus $100 emergency money, and I had to return that when I came back, unless I could justify the use of any of it for any emergency. So I came back to the ranch. I arrived in the evening, and that evening the message went round to everybody. The ranch is bankrupt. And in Buddha Hall the next morning we were told, "You have 3 days to be out of here." I was kind of awed with the magic of it, for me personally, that all my friends would be out there as well. Great. So next day I got a ride down the road to California and I was still Rajen and went to see Amitabh. I must have visited him twice, because a few weeks later I visited him, and on the counter of the Sannyasin Center was a newspaper, the Rajneesh Times, that came out every 2 weeks. And the front headline was the excommunication of Rajen, Amitabh, Tirtha, and 3 or 4 other of the top group leaders. And we were excommunicated because each of us was choosing to go our own way. It wasn't that we were saying we're not sannyasins, it was that we were saying we're not part of this commune anymore. I didn't know whether I was a sannyasin anymore, because I was struggling with that, the blissful letting go that lasted a day had turned into an ongoing struggle of what this really means. Meanwhile, Bhagwan was now on what was euphemistically called his world tour, which meant he was going from one country to another looking for asylum and getting kicked out of each one until he was compelled to go back to India. And there began Pune too. Eventually, Bhagwan, back in Pune, had established Pune, what came to be known as Pune too. He was no longer Bhagwan, he was now Osho. I felt no inclination to go to Pune. That was clear. And in any case, officially I'm excommunicated. And then every now and then I would hear that he was talking about me. And every now and then I would receive a message from him inviting me to come back. And when I didn't, when I declined the invitation, then I would hear that he was bad rapping me in the discourses in Pune. And this went on over a period of years. And gradually, one by one, the ashrams shut their doors to me. I remember the last ashram where my workshops were not cancelled was Hamburg. In Hamburg I had many years of wonderful friendships and relationships and love stories with the inhabitants of the Hamburg commune. So I went there to lead a workshop, and I was met at the counter by one of my old friends who said, Rajen, there's a message for you from Bhagwan. He wants to know if you're still a sannyasin, and if you are, he has something very special to offer you. The carrot dangles. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but I can't say I'm a sannyasin. That was the last workshop I led in Hamburg. That was the last workshop in those years that I led in a sannyasin commune. And shortly after that, I heard on the grapevine that Osho was now telling people that Rajen was totally on an ego trip, and the message came to me to stop using the name Rajen. And when I received this message, my response was, please tell Osho, he didn't lend me the name Rajen, he gave me it. It's my name now. It's up to me what I call myself. So I went on being Rajen for a few more months. And then one day I realized that I needed to let go. I needed to just, for my own sense of cleanness and innocence and freedom, I needed to let it all go. And so I came back to being Alan Lowen and began working as Alan Lowen. And finally, a few months before he died, I heard that he was again talking about me in discourse and saying that I was very angry with him and that I was saying bad things about him. And I wrote a letter to him and said, I just want you to know that I'm not angry with you, I'm not saying bad things about you. I am puzzled that the man who really gave me this opening into being me is now putting me down for being me. And I left it at that and sent off the letter, thought no more about it. And by then I was never invited to any sannyasin events anywhere. I had friends who were still my friends. It was an interesting time because what I discovered was that there were people who I thought were really, really dear lifelong friends who from one day to the next wanted nothing more to do with me. And there were other people who I thought were dear and lifelong friends who really were dear and lifelong friends, and it didn't matter to them at all that I was now persona non gratis. It wasn't so for them, and our friendships just went on. I was on Maui, living on Maui by now, 1990. And one morning, January 1990, I got a phone call from a friend on the island, a sannyasin. And she said, "Hey Rajen," and she called me Rajen, "Osho has left his body and we're all meeting. We're having a meditation in a house on the island, and you're welcome, you're invited." And I was very touched to be invited and astonished by the news, because he wasn't that old. And I went. Sitting in meditation there, many old friends, musicians playing, and a beautiful, beautiful vibe that was it carried the essence of what we really honoured in having been with him. The presence, the compassion, the love, the vision, the mystical. And I'm sitting there in meditation, and suddenly I remember my letter. And in the same moment that I remember the letter I've written him, I know that there is a reply waiting for me in my P.O. box in town. And I quietly get up, I leave the house, I drive into Paia, I go to my P.O. box, I'm not even wondering. I open it, and there's the letter from Hasia, his secretary. He never wrote anything himself, he always dictated it. Osho wants you to know that everything's good and you're always welcome. And I was so blown away by this that I decided I have to go to Pune, because so many people from all over the world were congregating to be where the Master had left his body. You know, these days around after a person has died, you may have experienced it yourselves, they're very rich days. It's a very rich time. So we had a good reason to be going there. So I was leading a group on the island the following weekend. 10 days after that, I was starting a 1-month vacation workshop in Mexico, down in the Yucatan Peninsula, and I arranged a plane ticket from Honolulu to Bombay on the Sunday evening after my group ended, and from there I would fly direct to Cancun, and I would get into my workshop just a few hours late. I then discovered that I needed a visa to go to India, which had never been the case in the old days of Pune 1, when anybody who was British was totally welcome in India with just a British passport. So I called the Indian consulate in San Francisco and was told, yes, if you send it by express with an express envelope inside, we will get it back to you by Thursday. This was Monday. Great. Thursday it doesn't come. Friday I'm on the phone all day long. Saturday morning I call again and somebody answers. And I say, you know, I'm calling you because you're supposed to have sent my passport with my visa. I'm due to fly to India on Sunday evening. Yes, your passport is sitting on the counter here in front of me. I said, what do you mean? You're supposed to have sent it. Yes, but you did not put the right money in. I said, you told me to put in $15. $15 for American passport. $45 British passport. I couldn't go. So I let it go, and 10 days after that I flew to Cancun and made my way down to the Yucatan Peninsula. And one night we're sleeping, living in thatched cottages on the beach, on this beautiful sandy beach. I'm asleep in my hammock in my thatched cottage, and I have a dream that is more than a dream. It's like a vision. I'm asleep in a room halfway up a high tower, and the door opens and Osho comes in, and I sit up and he stands at the foot of my bed and he tells me to continue his work. And then he turns and he leaves. And I get up and I follow him out of the room. down this old medieval staircase, and I go open these doors, walk through them, and find myself in a cathedral. He's not there, but there are two lines of sannyasins. There's a line of male sannyasins facing this way, and a line of women facing the men. Everybody's naked. And I realize I'm also naked. And I walk across and I join the line of men, just standing in the middle of it. And the door at the end of the cathedral opens and Osho walks in. And he walks down the line, down the aisle between us, namasteing, and he stops in front of me and he namastes and he initiates me as Alan. And then he turns and he leaves. Now, his logo in those years, you may know, is a great white bird, and in its shadow, under its wing, is a smaller grey bird, the disciple flying under the wing of the master. I am so blown away by this dream. It's so real that I wake up in shock. I get up out of my hammock and I walk down to the edge of where the sand meets the ocean, and I'm standing there. It's like 3-4 o'clock in the morning, and the ocean is just gently lapping, and the stars are shining, there's a moon, and as I stand there, just full with this sense of him, I hear this whoosh, 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 and I look up, and over my head from behind me flies this great white bird and just flies out to sea and disappears. And that is the end of my story with Bhagwan and Osho. And what to make of the dark stuff, I don't know. What I live with is an eternal gratitude for what I lived with him and in his communities, in his communes, his ashrams, what I learned with him and his sannyasins. And I cannot feel anything but gratitude for what he gave me. And who he was remains for me an eternal enigma. I see this enlightened being. I see this Indian man with his falling in love with what he finds in the West, with the Rolexes and the Rolls Royces and the wonderful robes and the hoopla, and about the stuff that went on in the ranch and how it all went so bad, and how much was him and how much was Sheila. Honestly, I don't know. I just know what I lived with him. That's it.
I visited Rajneeshpuram in spring of '83. Just friends. I was at the University of Oregon, and we were like, let's go see what's going on in Antelope. All right. And so we went, and it was very... What was strange to me was that it was really clear that the kids were told not to interact with us. Like, children would stay away. Like, we would go say hi to someone, and they would just be, like, gone. It felt very... We were hoping, I think, for some kind of, like, open-hearted, like, this is going to be comfortable and sweet, and we were, like, you know, hippie kids at UO in the theater department wanting some experience like that, and what we experienced was the opposite of that. It was you can't talk to them. You guys are outsiders. You're not going to experience any of this, and so I don't know. Was there some kind of kids are not allowed to talk to outsiders?
This was what I mean about how things became less and less free. You know, if that had been Pune in the 70s, the story was totally different. Didn't matter whether you were a sannyasin kid. There was no such thing as insider or outsider. Mm-hmm. It was just what happened for you when you chose to become a sannyasin yourself. And for the kids, half of them didn't know if they were sannyasins or not. It wasn't an issue. They were just there having a good time. Mm-hmm. And on the ranch, as I say, the rules and regulations just came in, one after another after another. And oftentimes, it didn't make sense why the rules were coming in. That, for example, to me, it's ludicrous. I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. You're the first person who's ever told me that.
Good friend of mine was a kid, and he said that he was really told very clearly, you don't interact with anybody who's not part of the community. It's like the paranoia was really put deep in him. Like, something terrible will happen to you if you do.
There was a lot of paranoia brewed up on the ranch.
When did it close?
November 85.
And how many were living there?
At its height, I would say 3,000. But many, many more there on any given day, because there were so many people coming from all over the world and staying to do workshops and meditations, and especially when the festivals happened, of course. I once guesstimated that directly I earned for the ashram between $6 and $10 million, and indirectly 10 times that amount from the mega rich who came to my workshops, got turned on to Bhagwan, became sannyasins, and donated.
Like, been to quite a few of your workshops over the years, of the particular rituals that you do, how many of them came almost directly from what you were doing with Bhagwan, and how many were bringing up from the outside?
I was already leading groups before I became a sannyasin, and I always designed my own workshops. At the same time, I know that there's something that comes from me, from being with him, that has nothing to do with this or that process or meditation.
Did it ever raise flags for a lot of people, or for you, just even the Rolls Royces? I mean, did people ever question it?
I think all of us questioned. And it really is catch-22. Okay, so what is he doing, buying all these Rolls Royces? I could rationalize it, and did, by saying he's just showing us our own materialism and the absurdity of it in the most absurd way, because he did love the absurd. And it reminded me too of George Gurdjieff, who was one of the great mystics of the early and mid-20th century, who had his own ashram, if you like, in France. It was called the Priory. And in the Priory, he had people, for example, build incredible structures and then tear them down. It was absurd. And the meaning you don't find in any kind of logic. I imagined what he was doing, what Gurdjieff was doing, was just creating a device for his disciples to go through their stuff. And certainly the Rolls-Royce thing was putting us through our stuff. It was my experience of him, especially in the 70s, that was my guiding light, if you like.
What bit of advice would you have for a person drawn to some kind of a organization that some people would label a cult, and some people would say has lots of beauty associated with it.
I'd say you have to trust your own intention and your own need. My need in going to him in 1977 was to break free of the traps that I felt myself caught up in, even though I was already working with people, and the fact that in him I sensed a being who was free of those and who could enable me to find that freedom. So I think it's not so much about, well, it is about who he or she is. You have to have a basic trust in them. And then is this what I need to give myself? And I knew I needed to give myself this. Yeah, I told you one of my regrets on the ranch, not pulling the tablecloth. The other one was that I didn't leave much earlier. And at the same time, as I regret that, I respect myself for daring to trust as long as I did. Although there are sannyasins, I know, who would say to me, Rajen, you blew it. It was impossible and you didn't trust. And some of them are still sannyasins. And some of them send me nasty messages every now and then.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I'm curious now in your reflection, what concept of discipleship and following, what that means to you now.
You do it because you have to.
Mm-hmm.
In 1977, the way it came to me, I felt I have to respond to this. And two of the most important days in my life are the day I became a sannyasin and the day I let it go. And they both really matter. That's discipleship.
Well, I'm really struck because, I was there for a lot of what you're talking about, and also with you when you came to Maui, when you started your Art of Being, and we're going through all that with Osho about dropping the name, and when he died, and I was there, so it's just been really auspicious to be here this evening, hearing the journey through your sharing, having shared some of that journey, with thousands of others and you there, and then with you a bit more connectively on Maui for some time as well. Beautiful.
Yeah, Maui's a haven. I have so many sannyasin friends on Maui. And they're not busy with whether I'm Alan or Rajen. In fact, I often get called Rajen there, and I like it. There's something very affectionate about it. It doesn't mean I'm a sannyasin, it just is how I'm known to my old friends. I like the Zen saying, Zen mind, beginner's mind. And I love being at the beginning. Yeah, let's call it a day.
Thank you. Thank you.
And why did you come here? Because Bhagwan is here, and somehow he's someone essential in my life. He's the most essential being I've ever met in my life.